Thank you very much, David. And thanks to the Academies. It's always a privilege to be part of meetings like this, and I think FDA is delighted to have the opportunity of participating. I also did want to mention, or at least have it on the record, that the things I'm going to say are my opinions and don't necessarily represent those of FDA. So I was asked to talk about policy considerations, which is a kind of difficult topic. So if I've just got the... Let me just make sure that I've got this. So actually I have to thank many of my predecessors at the meeting for covering a lot of my slides. The first one I credit to Noah, who made it very clear yesterday that I didn't think DCTs were anything particularly new, decentralized clinical trials. I'm just curious to know in the audience, how many people in the audience have actually conducted a clinical trial with patients coming to see them and so on? Just to get a sense, yeah. So I've had the same experience over many years, and when a patient leaves your office with their packet of pills and goes home, that's it. That's a decentralized trial. The patient takes their pills with them. We don't know what they're going to do with them, whether they're going to follow the doses, whether they're all going to be taken, what they're going to do with their adverse events, whether we're going to hear about everything. If they have a patient diary, whether they're going to really report things faithfully or just fill it in 2 minutes before they see you. And when they come back 3 weeks later with an empty pill box with maybe 2 pills stuck to the bottom and a dog-eared patient diary, that's the decentralized world we live in. That's not why we're here. That's not what we want to do. So really, what's new? What are we going to improve here? We've had tools before, IVRS, interactive voice response systems, telephone follow-up, patient diaries, and so on. But in terms of what's new, I think there are 2 big things. First of all, technologies for communication, data capture, and transmission. So I think that's one big opportunity for us. And the second one, which is also important, is recognition of the value of local healthcare providers in performing trial-related functions. We've had a lot of background on different trials that formed a model. We didn't discuss this one, which I thought I would raise briefly. This was the GISI study using streptokinase after myocardial infarction. I thought it was interesting because the trial went to the patient. These were patients who were admitted to coronary care units throughout Italy. And you can see that by using that decentralized structure, they managed to recruit 11,000 patients with myocardial infarctions. They did use technology. It was called a telephone, and that's how people got randomized. And they either got streptokinase or not, and it showed a very significant impact on a very articulate endpoint, in my view, 21-day mortality, very clear. So there was certainly precedent for decentralizing how we get our data and getting widespread patient inclusion. The other 2 trials, which I'm certainly not going to dwell on because they were very nicely described. First of all, the remote trial, obviously both Craig and Steve told us all about it. I think it was a wonderful trial because basically it was precedent setting. This was a trial which was done under IND, and it was really the first example that FDA was engaged in this type of trial. A little bit about, actually this is an older version of the slides, but anyway, I'll just carry on with that. So we have to adapt or at least we have to interpret our regulations in the context of the sort of decentralized environment that we're talking about now. I think there's some considerations that are important. When we talk about a decentralized trial, we have to think about the disease area that we're talking about. Are we talking about a serious disease? Are we talking about a mild disease? Are we talking about something that evolves very slowly or something that happens very rapidly? As far as the investigational drug goes, are we talking about an intravenous drug? Are we talking about an oral drug? Are we talking about a toxic drug or a drug that's really benign? And we need to think about the types of functions that are being centralized when we talk about policy. So there were 4 big buckets that I wanted to address. To me, these are the policy issues. First of all, we need to think about the personnel in the trial. We need to think about the trial site. We need to think about the tools, and we need to think about the safety of patients. So as far as the personnel go, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the clinical investigator. Now, our regulations say very little about the patient encounter. In fact, as far as I can recall, there really isn't a reference to how the patient encounter should take place. But they say a whole lot about the personnel and about responsibilities of oversight, and that certainly makes good sense to me. So I thought I'd just cover some of those sort of oversight issues here. This is how the Code of Federal Regulations defines an investigator. An investigator is an individual who actually conducts a clinical investigation, that is, under whose immediate direction the drug is administered or dispensed to the subject. Note, under whose immediate direction, it doesn't say in a face-to-face encounter. In the event that an investigation is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is a responsible leader and sub-investigators are other members of that team. So the investigator or these obligations can sometimes be transferred to a CRO, or sub-investigators. Those are people who are listed on Form 1572. They have a whole lot of investigatory responsibilities, which we've spoken about. But then there are a whole lot of other potential participants in a trial, which we've sort of spoken about. Obviously, we can incorporate local healthcare providers. This may be local clinics, local physicians, nurses, physical therapists, phlebotomists. There may be ancillary medical services, for example, radiology services, laboratories. There may be support services, and these things may involve technology support, transport, administrative things. So there are many people that are involved in the trial, and they have different roles. So the investigator basically the investigator and sub-investigator need to have a pretty good understanding of the protocol. They need to know what's going on. They need to understand the investigational product. They need to have direct and substantial involvement in the trial. And they need to be listed on the Form 1572 with all the accompanying obligations. The other participants in the trial don't necessarily need to qualify for all these criteria. In general, these people can be employed particularly because there's no difference between the tasks they perform in clinical care or in clinical research. They don't necessarily need to know about the protocol or the drug, and examples that I give are phlebotomists, radiological, people who make radiology reports, pathology reports, or perform EKGs. So I thought I would just remind ourselves what the statutory responsibilities are for investigators. They have to follow the protocol. They have to personally conduct or supervise the study, although, as I mentioned, delegation is permitted. They have to make sure that the study is conducted with informed consent, that patients know what's happening to them. There has to be an institutional review board to cover this. They have to report adverse experiences. They have to understand the risks and side effects of the drug. These are all listed on the back of the 1572. They have to ensure that all associates assisting in the conduct of the study are informed about their obligations. There's record keeping requirements, and they have to report to an IRB. How about the site? Well, the site is really something that's not very well described in our regulations either. Traditionally, it's a physical site, but this is really, as I say, not defined. The site is usually where the intervention is provided and where the assessments for the trial are carrying out. But the questions that we have are there sort of limits to the decentralization of these activities under a single investigator's supervision? And I think that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And how will these decentralized sites be supervised, monitored, and so on? So just to amplify a little bit on those questions, in a traditional sort of clinical trial, an investigator may engage with maybe 10, 15 patients, and they keep adequate records. The patient comes back and they'll know whether something serious has happened, whether the patient's missing, whether the drugs were lost, etc., etc. But with this decentralized environment, one of the concerns is you may be able to incorporate hundreds of patients, and how do we know what's going on? So I think from a regulatory standpoint, it's very important to think of this type of supervision in the decentralized environment and to plan accordingly. How will the supervision be imposed. So it has to be obviously contextualized in terms of what the trial does. I mean, if the trial is a very simple trial like the GISI trial, perhaps supervision is not that much of a concern. But if the trial requires much more vigilance, if it's a depression trial or something where people's behaviors are not predictable, I imagine we would need to think of trials where supervision is much more closely reined in. And I think that at some point with these decentralized sort of platforms, we're going to have to figure out what supervision entails. Does it entail a visit 1, 2, and 3 at set times when a person is going to review that data? We have to have some idea of what's actually going to happen, because to me this is one of the biggest regulatory challenges with these trials. And one can certainly see the case where if you have, for argument's sake, a 2,000 patient study at a site, one can certainly see how the trial can fall apart if there's no adequate supervision. So I think this is a very important thing. The other considerations, at least from the regulatory standpoint, are how are we going to inspect these trials and how are we going to monitor them. And I think the same principles apply as applied previously. The record keeping has to be adequate. The investigator has to basically know what's going on and be available to be subject to monitoring, and his records have to be able to be reviewed. As far as the tools for the trial go, so that's another big section. Obviously, this is a big area of opportunity, and to some extent, it's almost a separate discussion from what we're talking about decentralized clinical trials. I guess we've heard a fair amount about the technologies, and I think these are obviously very exciting opportunities for us. The communication tools that are used in a trial are obviously communication systems. There may be video, there may be audio, there may be remote data capture by electronic patient-reported outcome tools, and clearly biosensors are a big piece of the future. And we have to think about our Part 11 regulations, which really just ensure the integrity and the security of electronic records. Other thoughts, and there are many more, are that we have to be sure about the attribution. We have to know where the data comes from. We have to be sure about the accuracy and precision of biosensor measurements. We have to understand the data security. The data cannot be tampered with. We don't want people messing with the data that comes from a trial. And we have to make sure that there are audit trails so that we can reconstruct what happened. I think some of the concerns were raised yesterday about the accuracy of these tools and getting false readings from a cell phone, which is measuring steps when you're traveling in a golf cart. I think we all recognize these things. I think it's very important to establish the accuracy and the precision, the fact that we don't get false positive readings. We build other buffers into our systems. Trials are randomized and they're blinded. So if there are going to be problems in one arm, there are going to be problems in both. And if there's going to be a signal, you probably want to see it in an inferiority study, because if you don't, you're probably not going to know the difference between the two arms. So I think there are other ways in which we try and buffer these things. And sure, there's going to be noise and there are going to be errors. But on the other hand, there are certainly sort of intellectual safeguards that can be implemented. Just a couple of words about patient safety. So from my point of view, patient safety is really not that different from a traditional outpatient trial. We have to make sure that patients have access to qualified professionals to address adverse events, and one has to make provisions for prompt capture of safety data from patients to healthcare providers so that we can see what's going on during the course of the trial. Oversight of safety may be actually good in these situations where we have things like continuous glucose monitoring or arrhythmia monitoring. And they obviously bring with them attendant concerns. We have to make sure that technology failure doesn't jeopardize patient safety or, for that matter, the value of the data. We have to make sure that the inability to contact study staff isn't a problem. They should be able to get in touch with people if distances are large. We have to take into account potential risks for physical risks from biosensors, for example, things like occluding blood supply, and clearly the risks of erroneous data, like low glucose readings, which may result in very serious consequences for the patient. So just to recap, I mean, this is one simple algorithm of what I imagine these things look like. Some people look at them as a hub and spoke, but we have principal investigators and sub-investigators in charge of their site, and beneath them we either have local providers and patients, or we have electronic platforms that connect patients directly with these investigators and sub-investigators, and each of them have different responsibilities as we go down the cascade. The investigator has a substantial role in the study. They have to be qualified by experience and training. They require knowledge of the study, as I mentioned, the protocol, the drug, and the rules. They have to know when to withdraw their patients and what to do if they get toxic signals. They have to be aware of safety concerns and informed consent. The local provider, again, may not require this knowledge, and this may be things like pathologists, endoscopists, radiologists who are just doing procedures they do as part of their routine medical care. The electronic platform I've spoken a little bit about. It may just be a communication platform, it may be a biosensor, and it's very important that we have some quality grasp of these, of the functioning of these tools, the accuracy and the precision. And finally, very important to emphasize from the patient's point of view. If I'm a patient in a trial, I want to be informed of what's happening to me. I want to know what the informed consent says. I want to make sure that the technology I'm given is something that I know how to use and that is not going to fall off and be clunky and draw attention to me in ways that I don't want. I want to make sure that there's tech support, so when the thing starts beeping or overheating, at least somebody's going to help me out. I want to make sure that I have an adequate communication tool with the investigators, so if there's a problem I can call them. And what I didn't include here, and it was also obviously an important feature for discussion, is retention. What's going to keep me in the trial? If these tools are very good and they can get intensive data with high signal to noise ratios early on, perhaps these trials can be shortened, and that will obviously increase retention. Perhaps the numbers of the patients can be reduced. If the signal is high, we don't need 10,000 patients to figure out whether it's statistically significant. So I'm running out of time and pushing against the clock here, but these are my conclusions. There are new opportunities using mobile technologies and local providers to bring the trial to the patient. These obviously promise things like inclusivity, convenience, and real-world experience. But again, just to reiterate, we need to address patient safety, privacy, data integrity, and very important, the responsibilities of investigators. So I'll stop there. Thanks.